thing, and it's really bad because I don't have anything sort of as scholarly to say, but I will try to keep it particularly brief because I'm in a good mood, and when people are in a good mood, then they go on talking and talking and so on and so forth. And of course, the reason I'm in a good mood is because I'm amongst friends and colleagues and very, very many friends. But I will start with like a close friend and who is Richard Caplan, who is of course, is a full professor in Oxford, a distinguished colleague. He has a sort of like also played quite a number of institutional roles within Oxford University, so not just a distinguished colleague and exemplary scholar, but also someone who knows how to operate within a university setting. And let's just remember, and a good friend of Italy and of Italian students and scholars of international relations. Let's just remember his key role in the doctoral school in international studies, which we used to hold in the Dolomites, and which was a really good initiative that contributed quite a bit to the world of international relations in Italy, and which this is like I'm giving to you, I'm trying to replicate right outside of Italy, in Lugano at Università Svizzera Italiana. So stay tuned, because that's one of my new ventures, and I hope we can sort of restart that initiative, like if not quite in Italy, like just across the border. So so we welcome him, we thank him yet again. He will tell us about his excellent book, which really should be like, even if you're not interested in measuring peace for all the good reasons that Emanuele highlighted, it should be read anyway by anyone who studies sort of political science or international relations, and indeed anyone who's in the social sciences, as an example of an excellent, succinct, and sort of like to the point piece of writing in the social sciences. So it's really an exemplary volume. I really sort of like wholeheartedly recommend it. And now that I'm involved more and more into administration and things like that, I mean, it's one of those books that I really savor and and took the time to read from cover to cover. So is basically the first reason I'm in a good mood. The second one is that I'm amongst actually people who know about politics and international relations, so real colleagues in the discipline in Italy. As you all know, I mean, like, he's probably the only one not who can afford not to know this here is Professor Caplan, but he knows because he's like he speaks Italian, he knows how we work. I mean, we are all divided into guilds in Italy, and this is our guild. I mean, this is SPS 04, and in particular, like international relations. And as someone like me who sort of like works in partibus infidelium as one of the very few people in SPS 04 at Ca' Foscari, University of Venice, it is a real joy to be here with all the sort of friends and colleagues who actually do what I do, because sometimes I have a bit of a gaslighting issue, because everybody here tries to explain to me what the politics and international relations is on a weekly, if not daily basis. And sometimes I start doubting myself, which is why I try to spend also as much time as possible in Oxford during regular years to sort of like be in touch with the discipline. I mean, we even have, like, by the way, a Osservatorio Politica Relazioni Internazionali that someone wants to jumpstart at Ca' Foscari, University of Venice, which basically has no one who studies like Politica Relazioni Internazionali, so no SPS 04, so to speak. So these are the vagaries of the Italian university system, but it is also a testament to the fact that politics and international relations in particular are very popular among students. That's why everybody sort of tries to get into the act, even if like they don't really know what we're talking about, or they try to sort of like, they come from LR, they come from history, and so on and so forth, and they try to sort of like jump on the bandwagon. But instead here we are delighted because we do have like one of the great scholars at the global level of international relations who is connecting, as Emanuele said before, with young and promising scholars in Italy. So this is really the kind of events that puts me in a good mood, that fills my heart with joy. And this is why you see me also feisty. But as I said, I don't want to sort of like talk for too long just because I'm in a good mood. I want to savor this event. And so without any further ado, I'll give a virtual floor to Professor Caplan, and I thank him wholeheartedly for being here with us today.
Okay, right. Well, what I want to do today then is to explore the question that's at the heart of my book. And you see here a picture of the cover of the book. And that question is the following. How do we know that the peace that's been established following a civil war is a stable peace? Now, by stable, I mean not prone to relapse. And peace stability is one dimension, really just one dimension of the quality of a peace. It's not the only dimension, a point I'll come back to later in my presentation, but it is an important dimension. As Willy Brandt, the former Chancellor of West Germany, once famously said, peace is not everything, but without peace, everything is nothing. Now, of course, this was said against the backdrop of a nuclearized Cold War, when the absence of peace could have been tantamount to obliteration on a global scale. But nevertheless, the point about the importance of peace stability, I think, remains valid, as anyone who's witnessed the ravages of violent conflict can tell you. Now, peace stability shouldn't be taken for granted. Conflict-affected countries are particularly vulnerable to conflict relapse, as you can see in this slide. Now, with my colleague, formerly at Oxford, Anke Heffler, now at Konstanz, we looked at all internal conflicts, that is, all civil wars that ended in or after 1990 until 2013. And we looked at how long the peace survived. So for purposes of this analysis, the start of a peace period or peace spell is marked by the end of armed conflict, whether the end is the result of a military victory, a ceasefire, a peace agreement, or simply the fizzling out of the armed conflict. And the peace has lasted for at least 1 year. And in the period that we observed from 1990 to 2013, there were 210 peace spells. That is, 210 conflict episodes ended in peace that lasted for at least a year. Now, just to be clear, these are not 210 separate conflicts. A single conflict can have multiple conflict episodes and multiple peace spells. It can be hot and cold. But as long as the peace spell lasts for at least 1 year, it constitutes, for our purposes, a peace spell. Now, this chart that you're looking at depicts how many peace spells break down and when this happens. It shows how long peace survives as measured in days. And you can see that at the beginning, all of our observations are at peace. After 2 years, 99% of all peace spells survive. That is, only 1% of all peace spells have failed and armed conflict has recurred. After 3 years, 83% of the peace spells have survived. But after 12 years, that is 4,380 days, only about half of the peace spells have survived. So that's a high rate of peace failure or conflict recidivism. Indeed, if you extend the timeline and focus not on peace spells, but on conflict-affected countries, you get another uncomfortable statistic. Between 1946, so just the end of the Second World War, and 2013, 105 countries have experienced civil wars. And of those 105 countries, more than half of them, 59 countries, have experienced a relapse into violent conflict, in some cases more than once, after peace has been established. So that's another reason why peace stability matters, because there's a high rate of conflict relapse or conflict recidivism. But another reason is because the cost of peacekeeping and peace building is significant. Now, here you see the cost of UN peace building expenditure from 1950 to 2013. And you can see how there's been very significant increase from the early days of peacekeeping from 1948. The approved budget for UN peacekeeping operations in the current year, which ends on the 30th of June 2022, is a little bit lower than what you see here. It's about 6.38 billion, but it's still quite significant. Now, bear in mind that this is for UN peacekeeping only. It doesn't include other UN peace consolidation efforts, nor the costs associated with the efforts of other organizations, whether they're governmental or non-governmental. Indeed, here, additionally, you can see are the number of regional peace operations, that is non-UN operations in the period from 1946 to 2013. Regional organizations, especially in Africa and Europe, have been taking on more and more responsibility for peacekeeping and for peace consolidation. So peace operation expenditure is another reason why peace stability matters. It's costly to restore peace when it collapses. Now, conflict relapse is the main reason why the UN Peacebuilding Commission, the PBC, was established at the UN, the World Summit back in 2005, the same summit at which the responsibility to protect was adopted. The PBC is really the latest new entity at the UN. And the member states that approved the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission did so, and now I'm quoting from the summit outcome document, recognizing the need for a dedicated institutional mechanism to address the special needs of countries emerging from conflict towards recovery, reintegration, and reconstruction. Special needs refers to the fragility of the peace in countries emerging from armed conflict, which is what you saw in that diagram, that chart earlier, the peace survival chart. Because, I mean, not only is there a high likelihood of countries emerging from violent conflict to fall back into conflict, but also there's a tendency for these countries to fall off the radar screen of the international community. And that's why the member states took the decision to establish this body, because they thought that an entity within the UN that was dedicated to focusing on the countries emerging from violent conflict would give those countries a better chance of survival. And these are the current 6 countries that are on the agenda of the UN Peacebuilding Commission. But when should a country graduate? When should a country come off the PBC's agenda? And that's the challenge that's facing the Peacebuilding Commission today. And it's a genuine practical concern. It's not an academic question only. They are today, wrestling with this question about when a country should come off the agenda. Now, if you look at the enabling resolution that established the PBC, there is an answer to that question. And it says, the Commission shall terminate its consideration of a country's specific situation when foundations for sustainable peace and development are established, or upon the request of national authorities of the country under consideration. So this tells us 2 things. One is that the country itself may request to come off the agenda. And the other thing is that when the foundations for sustainable peace and development have been established, that's when it is appropriate to terminate treatment, if you will, terminate preoccupation with this country. But that language really only begs the question, because how do we know when those foundations have been established? Going back to the question I presented at the outset, how do we know when the peace that's been established is a sustainable peace? And the problem is that there are no hard measures or indicators of a consolidated peace. In contrast, when you think about it, in contrast to, say, the indicators we have of a prosperous economy, notably certain macroeconomic fundamentals, or a healthy population, for instance, immunization rates or literacy rates, even though some of those can be contentious. I mean, for instance, GDP growth is challenged as an adequate measure of economic prosperity, but at least we have some in other realms fairly useful, if you will, indicators. Now, what about the absence of armed conflict? You could say that that's an indicator of the stability of a peace. But the problem is that this isn't really an indicator of a stable peace. It's symptomatic of a stable peace, but it's not itself an indicator of a stable peace. It doesn't tell us if the conditions are in place to ensure the survival of peace. And really the ultimate test of a sustainable peace, at least in cases where third parties have intervened, such as peacekeepers, necessarily comes after the fact. That is only when the international community has drawn down significantly or exited. And that's when we really know when a peace can survive. But that's quite late. And at least for planning purposes, we want to know before peacekeepers exit whether the peace is a stable one. So it's useful, if you will, for analytical purposes, but it's not really useful for practical planning purposes, because this is something that we need to know, before we take measures to draw down and to leave. So how can we know if a peace is a stable peace? Well, there are various ways one might approach the question, and one is to determine whether the factors that are known by scholars to be responsible for the onset, for the initiation of conflict, of civil war, are present. And if they are, then we have reason to be cautious about how stable the peace is. And scholars have identified a number of causes, which I think can be grouped broadly into three classes. The first is motivation. Motivation encompasses a wide range of often grievance-based subfactors, including relative deprivation, horizontal inequalities, ethnic insecurity, and political, social, and economic discrimination. You may be familiar with some of these terms and with some of the authors that are associated with them. The second class of causes can be grouped under feasibility, and that stresses more the importance of opportunity over motivation, suggesting that rebellion is more likely to occur when, for instance, material conditions favor it, and notably where the terrain is mountainous, allowing rebels to hide, where valuable resources are plentiful, allowing rebels to finance their activities from trade, and where external security commitments to governments are weak, which allow rebels to challenge governments more easily. The third class of causes, resilience, emphasizes the vulnerability of the state to various internal and external pressures, for instance, rising food prices or migration, and the capacity of states and their institutions to cope effectively with these pressures. Now, these factors aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. A number of explanations for the outbreak of civil war in some cases combine several of these factors. But there's two problems with this approach. And the first is that there is no consensus among scholars as to which causal factors matter or matter most. Indeed, as one scholar, Charles Call, observes in his book, Why Peace Fails, and I'm quoting, he writes, "There is tremendous disparity among scholars about whether certain factors are important or not, and about the degree to which they're important." And the second problem with this approach is that it assumes that the causes of conflict onset are the same as the causes of conflict recurrence. But in fact, there are often significant differences. For one thing, civil wars are transformative. So the root causes of a conflict may no longer pertain as a consequences that the conflict itself has generated. For instance, population displacements, or the rise of new political elites. I mean, think about the civil war in Afghanistan from 1989 to 1992, and how that facilitated the rise of fundamentalist Muslim forces, the Taliban in particular, that in turn provoked a new civil war from 1992. So another approach one can consider is to focus not on the causes of civil war, but on the causes of peace in the aftermath of civil war. And by that, I mean, what measures have been taken, what measures have been most successful in maintaining the peace after violent conflict, and have they been applied to the case in question? So again, the range of possibilities and the differences among scholars is considerable. Scholars have stressed the importance of the nature of civil war terminations, how civil wars end, whether by military victory or negotiated settlement or an inconclusive outcome, as I mentioned earlier. And that has implications, military victories tending to produce more stable outcomes. Another determinant is whether third-party guarantees have been offered, whether in the form of UN peacekeepers, for instance, or other regional security organizations. NATO stabilization forces have been used as well. Other scholars have focused on security sector reform, and whether that has been implemented, and the importance of that for the maintenance of peace. And finally, the nature of the peace settlement itself, how representative it is, how inclusive it is. Again, this is work that Chuck Call has done, which underscores the importance of inclusiveness. And indeed, if you think about the situation now in Afghanistan and the decision that was taken back in 2001 to exclude the Taliban from negotiations, you can ask yourself whether that has played out in the situation that we see there now, of what we're seeing. If what we're seeing now is one of the casualties of having excluded the Taliban from inclusion in a political settlement, which is not to say that it necessarily would have made for a more stable settlement. Again, as I said, as with the previous approach, there is again a lack of consensus among scholars as to the effects of these measures and which measures matter most. Now, there is growing recognition of the importance of monitoring the quality of the peace and the progress of peace consolidation, and also recognition of the difficulty among some scholars, at least, as is evident in this quotation. Monitoring the progress of peace is of such obvious value in any post-conflict society that the worth of doing so is rarely, if ever, challenged. However, the means used to do so is another matter. So the question then is, how do the major peace-building actors assess progress towards the achievement of a consolidated peace in light of everything we've been saying about the importance of establishing whether the peace is a stable peace? How do they know whether the peace that they're working to establish is a self-sustaining peace? And the fact is they often don't monitor progress, or they don't do it well enough. Now, what I'm going to say now about the practices of major peace building actors, I need to qualify, because there are notable exceptions to the generalizations that I'm going to be making. And in fact, I'll bring at least one of those to your attention in the book. I talk about a number of them, but I think it's fair to say that despite the exceptions, what I'm going to say now is fairly characteristic of peace-building organizations, and it remains a valid critique, again, notwithstanding these notable exceptions. And just to begin with, rarely are peace-building organizations actually tasked with assessing the quality of the peace, including the robustness of the peace that they're helping to build. And I call this strategic assessment. So rarely do peace-building organizations have a mandate for strategic assessment. What they do a lot of is reporting on developments in the field of operations, but reporting is not the same as strategic assessment. Every head of a UN peacekeeping operation, for instance, submits formal periodic reports to the Secretary General on the situation in the country in question, often on a quarterly or semi-annual basis. And here on this slide, you can see an example of a report of the special representative to the Secretary General that's been then transmitted to the Security Council. The Secretary, these reports, they vary in their content, but they typically provide an overview of major developments since the last report, an evaluation of progress in the implementation of the mandate, and a discussion of the key challenges facing the country in the operation. But again, not a strategic assessment. The reportings tended to be ad hoc and impressionistic. The Secretariat lacks any uniform understanding of the purpose of a field report and a Security Council briefing, and little guidance is provided to his representatives in preparing them. And I know this because I've talked with many former special representatives of the Secretary General, and this is what they've told me, that they receive very, very little guidance. They really learn on the job. Now, the other characteristic is that there's a tendency to measure what can be measured easily. So just to give you an example, measuring the number of training sessions on human rights organized for police officers rather than their qualitative effects, for instance, how respectful the police are of human rights. In other words, measuring outputs rather than outcomes, which are a lot harder, arguably, to measure because it requires going into the field and observing the performance of the police and making judgments about whether they conform or not to standards of human rights. That's a lot harder to do than it is to just check whether a checklist of whether somebody has attended a training session. The other characteristic is that the focus is on mandate implementation. Now that's reasonable. These operations are mandated to do a job, and they should be evaluated as to whether or not they are implementing the mandate that they have been tasked to do. But the problem is that mandates don't always reflect the requirements for achieving a sustainable peace. For one thing, mandates are often the fruits of political compromise. If you study the mandates as adopted by, again, the UN Security Council, you'll see that they very often represent compromises among especially the permanent 5 members of the council. And finally, the other problem is that in their exercises, in their assessments, the tendency is to be partial and not holistic, not comprehensive. And the reason for that is partly the flip side of actually a rather good thing, and that is that there is multilateral engagement often in peace building. There are many organizations, donor governments, non-governmental organizations, and they're all naturally concerned with progress in their own patch. I mean, that makes sense. But the problem is that as a consequence, they lose sight of the larger picture. So broadly speaking, the concern is fundamentally about evaluating the performance of peace operations or peace building operations, not with evaluating the quality of the peace that these operations are helping to produce. And that is a very important distinction, which I hope you can appreciate. Now, as I said, I'm generalizing. There are notable exceptions to these practices, which I discuss in my book. I've listed several of them here. all of them different. And I'm just going to focus on one for purposes of this presentation, because I want to make sure I have adequate time to go through even just the one, which I think I do. I will say just a few words about the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The OSCE has been at the forefront of peacebuilding organizations in developing a conflict analysis toolkit for the purpose of assisting the organization in analyzing emerging threats to the peace, including post-conflict peace, while at the same time identifying entry points for conflict prevention and for the building of sustainable peace. Now, as you may know, conflict prevention is a sensitive area for multilateral organizations because states are often wary of what they perceive to be meddling in their internal affairs, and no country wants to be put on a crisis watch list. But the prevention of violent conflict is much less costly and often more effective than efforts to build peace after conflict. And what prompted the OSCE to sharpen its peace measuring capabilities was the 2008 Georgia crisis, which saw an escalation of tensions over the Georgian breakaway territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia culminate in a war between Georgia and Russia. And that crisis caught the OSCE off guard. And as a consequence, member states took the decision subsequently to strengthen the organization's capabilities to analyze conflict situations in all phases of the conflict cycle, including early warning and early action. And as a result, the OSCE developed and rolled out this conflict analysis toolkit and a set of early warning indicators for use in the organization's field operations. And together, this toolkit and the indicators, they provide a framework for a systematic analysis of conflict setting at the local, regional, national, and international levels, including, but not limited to, assessments of how robust or fragile the peace is. And the framework stresses the importance of appreciating relevant contextual issues like socioeconomic and political conditions, as well as the influence of the broader regional context can exert on conflict dynamics. So it's actually quite comprehensive, to its credit. Now, by the OSCE's own reckoning, in the first year since the introduction of this framework, that is in the period from July 2012 to July 2013, the OSCE Secretary General raised concerns about what he called worrying developments that threatened the peace, arising from analysis on 11 occasions with respect to the OSCE region. And the OSCE's experience in Macedonia, what we now call North Macedonia, I think provides evidence of the effectiveness of these efforts. A combination of conflict analysis and early warning there alerted international officials to rising tensions in the run-up to elections that were being held in December 2016, when many of you may remember that the ruling party sought to undercut its opponents through a combination of intimidation and coercion directed towards non-governmental organizations, the media, as well as opposition political parties. And the OSCE, on the basis of its analysis, produced a trenchant critique of the situation of the government, which it shared with the European Commission. And that resulted in the latter effectively sounding the alarm. And in its November 2016 progress report by the Commission, it referred sharply to a political crisis in the country manifesting itself in state capture. Now, that's unusually harsh language for the EU. And I think it's reasonable to say that without its intervention, Macedonia might have succumbed to greater violence. That's not to say that there was an end to the violence, but I think that the situation could have spiraled out of control if the EU, again, on the basis of this analysis, which in part the OSCE was able to provide, if they had not intervened. And by contrast, although I won't go into details, in East Timor, where the UN had a very significant presence since 1999, it established a transitional administration there in 2000, there was no comparable conflict analysis. And indeed, notwithstanding the presence of the United Nations, the East Timor saw a resumption of violence, not major violence, but a significant outbreak of violence in 2006, which again caught it off guard completely. And a scholar, Olav Ofsted, who's looked carefully at the reporting, the analysis that the UN did during its time in East Timor, was unable to detect any effort at a conflict analysis, a kind of standard conflict analysis, if you will, of the situation, and faults the UN for failing to see the warning signs that it would have seen if it had been conducting such an analysis. Anyway, that's the OSCE conflict analysis toolkit. As I said, there are other examples of good practice, again, of what I call strategic assessment. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to move on to some fundamental issues in measuring peace. I'll talk about these briefly before I close. There are a number of challenging issues that arise in thinking about and actually measuring peace. I've listed a few of them here. First of all, what do we measure? And this harks back to something that Emanuele Castelli was saying at the outset of my presentation. What do we measure? Well, peace, of course, but what is peace? This is a fundamental question. At the very least, it's the absence of armed conflict and what we sometimes call negative peace. But is that all peace is? Now, sometimes that's the nature of peace that we have, for instance, in Kosovo right now, between Serbs and Albanians. And many would argue, however, that that's a weak peace, a deficient peace. Peace understood as not war conflates the character of peace as varied as that which prevails in Sweden, for instance, with that of North Korea. Both countries at present would qualify as states at peace by this minimal measure, but the quality of peace in each case differs dramatically when one takes into consideration violence other than armed conflicts, such as torture or aggressive policing. Now, some would say quality peace exists only where there's mutual respect and fundamental goodwill between relevant actors, between members of society. Some would even go farther and say that peace only exists when all structural violence in a society has been eliminated, institutionalized discrimination, for instance. So how far do we go in defining peace? This has clear implications for how we measure peace. Related to this, there are a lot of other conditions we can measure or try to measure that are cognates of peace. For instance, stability, security, resilience. These are not the same as peace, but they're closely related to peace. And for example, when NATO deployed to Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1995 in support of the military provisions of the Dayton Peace Accord, it wasn't the quality or the degree of peace that it sought to assess. Rather, it designed a diagnostic tool to measure what it called the return to normality, and using a number of everyday indicators of normality, such as the availability of food and goods, the level of prices, the occupancy and use of public and private buildings, and things along these lines, NATO was concerned to assess progress towards achieving, in its words, sufficient stability in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So not the same as peace, but something quite akin to peace. Now that's the character of peace. What about the requirements of peace? What does peace, whatever it looks like, require to thrive? We don't always get this right. We often assume that all good things go together. For instance, that building democratic states after war is important for building more peaceful states. But the irony is that autocracy may actually make a greater contribution to the consolidation of peace because of the polarizing effects that democratization can have on states, especially formerly non-democratic states that are emerging from violent conflict. Now, based on a study that he and his colleagues conducted of post-conflict situations, Paul Collier found that, and now I'm quoting from his study, their study, severe autocracy appears to be highly successful in maintaining the post-conflict peace. If the polity is highly autocratic, the risk of reversion to conflict is only 24.6%. Whereas if it's not highly autocratic, the risk more than doubles to 62%. So the authors recognize that liberal democratization may be an intrinsically desirable outcome. It may be something that we want for society, but they caution it shouldn't be thought that democratization will increase the durability of post-conflict peace. That's a very inconvenient, uncomfortable truth. Now, another question, going back to this slide, how do we measure peace in divided societies? Different members, different actors may hold different views about the meaning of peace. The views of government elites may differ from those of rebel leaders. And these various views don't necessarily exist in harmony. Indeed, they may be mutually exclusive, which makes the challenge of measuring peace in the aftermath of civil war all the more difficult. There's a tendency to assume an underlying harmony of interests among members of conflict-affected communities, and a corresponding failure to appreciate that desiderata for peace may not always be shared. So, for instance, how do you satisfy those who wish to live under strict religious rule and those who prefer a more liberal order? Compromise isn't always possible. Do you have Sharia law on alternate days of the week? I mean, that obviously wouldn't work. And this is obviously a problem that Afghanistan is confronting now. And here's what one Taliban fighter told the Financial Times just the other week. The most important thing, he said, is the establishment of a pure Islamic regime. We can sit for talks about everything, but not about an Islamic regime. This is our red line. And also, what happens when local preferences don't map onto international preferences? So, for instance, in Mostar, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, after the war ended, Muslims and Croats who are now living largely separately, separated by the river that you see here, they wanted separate power generation facilities for each community rather than a single unified power plant. And the World Bank, which was financing the construction, didn't object initially, but it then came under enormous pressure from international critics who argued that such arrangements, separate energy generation facilities, would further entrench ethnic division, even if it would contribute to building peace, arguably a negative peace. So how does one measure the quality of peace in these circumstances? And who should decide? Another issue is the politicization of measurement. ISAF in Afghanistan adopted many different frameworks of assessment of its performance in the field. And the difficulty, in part, among other things, is that these assessments were vulnerable to cherry picking, to selecting data to suit one's purpose in support of over-optimistic assessments at higher echelons of authority, where there was pressure on those conducting the assessment, providing the assessment, to deliver good news. So they would select the data that supported those assessments. The United Nations itself has had experiences with the suppression of information, the suppression of data from the field, because the data might have threatened very delicate moments in negotiations between warring parties. But nonetheless, this is a risk that accurate assessments can be manipulated, can be susceptible to what I call politicization. And the last issue I want to highlight is that of the lack of local knowledge. In his book, Can Intervention Work?, a book Rory Stewart wrote with Gerald Knaus, in the section to which that he contributed to on Afghanistan, Rory Stewart talked about the lack of local knowledge on the part of international personnel, what he called a central cause of the humiliating mess in Afghanistan. And earlier, with regard to the war in Vietnam, the US engagement in that war, Robert McNamara, who was the chief architect of that war, the US phase of that war, in his memoirs, he would later bemoan what he called our profound ignorance of the history, culture, and politics of the people in the area. And you may recall that the US was persuaded that this was a war for communist domination in the region, the theory of the falling dominoes, the domino effect, rather than what we understand more accurately for it to have been, which was a war of national liberation from colonial rule, first French and then US-backed proxies in the South. So a failure to appreciate the fundamental character of the war. And what's needed as a result is what I call an ethnographic approach. And an ethnographic approach for the purposes of strategic assessment would favor greater reliance on knowledge of local culture, local history, and especially the particular conflict dynamics at work in a given conflict, including at the micro level, because conflict dynamics are not the same across a country necessarily, especially a country as large as, for instance, the Democratic Republic of Congo. I mean, what's happening in the East may not be mirrored in what's happening in other parts of the country, even if there is violent conflict in those other parts. Now, as Severina Tesser observes in her excellent book, Peaceland, she says, familiarity with local context is crucial. In-depth knowledge of local histories, cultures, traditions, attitudes, and worldviews remains critical throughout project implementation. So just a couple of concluding observations. I've been emphasizing the importance of strategic assessment. It's not merely a technical exercise, although there are technical aspects to it. I mean, there are techniques that can be employed that can enhance the utility, the accuracy of strategic assessment, but there are fundamental political and normative questions. What is peace? What is the peace that we aspire to achieve? And who decides that? Who's going to be making that decision? And it's not enough to say, well, it's important to take local preferences into consideration, because again, going back to what I said earlier about divided societies, many of them are, especially after conflict, highly polarized. So it is dodging the question really to say, well, let the local population decide, or at least reserve room for the local population to contribute to this debate. And the other point I want to close with is that strategic assessment, important though it is, it's not a panacea. It's not the only thing that matters. And it's not even necessarily a solution. First of all, to employ a term that's used in political science and other social sciences, we are unfortunately subject to bounded rationality. We are often limited in the knowledge that we have of a situation. Conflicts are highly complex social phenomena. and it can be very, very difficult to gain sufficient appreciation of the conflict in order to be able to understand, again, the requirements for establishing a stable peace. And finally, as I've indicated as well, at the end of the day, politics will often trump other considerations, even the most sound analysis. Decisions will be taken by countries that have interests. They may be troop contributing countries, they may be donor countries that will not reflect the needs of a conflict affected country for the maintenance of peace in that country. And that is just the way of the world, unfortunately. So even the best knowledge, the best analysis does not ensure that the best decisions will be taken. So to go back to the question I laid out at the beginning, can we know that the peace that's been established following a civil war is a stable peace? Well, the answer is actually no, we can't. At least we can't know with certainty, but we can know with greater confidence. And that's what I've tried to show here. That's what I've tried to show in my book, that there are approaches that can be taken that will help to enhance the understanding that we have of the stability of peace and the measures that need to be taken to ensure its stability. So this is the actual answer. It isn't possible, but it is possible to ascertain the quality of a peace and the vulnerability of that peace to conflict relapse with higher levels of confidence. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emanuele. So it's a pleasure to be here, and it was really great to listen to this very comprehensive and I would say also engaging and presentation that opens the floor, I think, to a number of considerations that we're going to leave to our new generation or new round of colleagues and scholars. So we're having 4 area focused presentation lined up, and we're going to follow the sequence that you also have in the program for the event. After that, so I'm going to ask the presenters to stick to approximately 10 minutes, and I'm going to time you, and I'm going to pester you on the chat, I think. So that's the newer version of what we used to do with little boards during conferences. So please keep an eye on your chat. After that, we're going to give Professor Caplan the chance to jump back in. And then we will see also how time goes, but I also hope we're going to have the chance to have some Q&A or some feedback from other colleagues, possibly again through the chat, and myself and Emanuele will see if we might be able to put together some questions and then put them to the presenter. So we're going to start with Irene Costantini, who is a research fellow in international relations at the University of Naples, L'Orientale. And she's the author of a book for Routledge as well, and several journal articles, and her research interests include the politics of international interventions, the political economy of conflict and post-conflict transition, and the processes of state transformation in the Middle East and North Africa. So again, all themes that very much resonate with the presentation we just heard. And her specific sub-regional focuses are mainly on Iraq and Libya. And I'm going to give the floor to her specifically to talk about how this presentation echoes with her own work on Iraq and its surroundings. So Irene, the floor is yours.
Well, I'll start with thanking Marco for the kind introduction and also the organizer for having me participating in this discussion.
Thank you.
which I found extremely interesting and inspiring. Do let me know. Okay, so I'll start. Professor Caplan presentations today, but also the reading of the book, Measuring Peace, made me think, or maybe better to say rethink, about some of my research in novel ways, and trying also to reflect on how to assess peace and how to measure peace in the context which I study. I don't have much time today, so I'll try to focus only on 4 points, which I think are interesting to bring forward for the discussion. The first one is related to the task of assessing peace in Iraq. What I will be doing today is talking mostly about Iraq, although some of the points that I'll raise are also, I think, can also be applied to other contexts across the Middle East and North Africa region. So when it comes to assessing peace, I think the important thing is to start with, as Professor Caplan does in the book, also start from the parallel concept of stability and resilience, which are easier, I would say, to assess. When it comes to stability, I think Iraq has enough stability. For instance, it has enough stability to allow the country to hold national elections in 2 days. So there is a certain degree of stability. But if we do understand stability as an equilibrium in relations, we should also recognize that this is a very fragile type of stability that can be disrupted by very simple events, as it happened over the last 20 years, but also by big events such as an election. If we take the other parallel concept of resilience instead, Iraq proves to be lacking in resilience. The Iraqi state, the Iraqi institutions lack resilience. Shocks the country knew over the past 20 years, some of them external shocks, such as economic crisis due to the fall of oil prices in 2014 or during the pandemic, or internal crises like the expansion and the conquest of the Islamic State, have only been managed thanks to the help of external actors. This proves that the country, the state, the institution of that country are not resilient. But on the other hand, now we should also think about resilience with a negative connotation. What actually proved to be resilient in Iraq is the Iraqi political leadership, which is very much part of the problem in Iraq, and who proved instead to have the capacity to withstand any type of shock or threat, such as those coming from the demands of the people asking for a change in political leadership. So here, resilience assumes a negative connotation and can be seen in the Iraqi political leadership. So if the country has a fragile type of stability, lacks in resilience, but its political leadership is, when we go on and try to assess peace, in the terms that Professor Caplan presented in the presentation and in the book, we cannot talk about a stable peace. Precisely because violence cannot be excluded as a means for political competition. And the more we move towards a comprehensive understanding of peace, the less we see of it in the country. The second point that I want to raise is instead connected to the discussion on the relevance of war termination. And here it's important to highlight, as well as in other contexts in the Middle East, that the post-conflict phase in a country like Iraq coincide with the post-regime change. And regime change comes with some assumptions, such as the assumptions that people are welcoming regime change, but is in fact, a form of an implicit victor peace that doesn't leave space to peace negotiations. So some of the issues that are, however, relevant to be negotiated come to be included instead in, for instance, the Iraqi constitutions, so the main documents that should highlight what the country should look like. So instead of having these discussions as part of a peace negotiation, they become part of how to structure a specific political system. And this has important consequences for how then peace and conflict dynamics developed in the aftermath of regime change. And some of these developments, for instance, the constitutions became one of the tools that is preventing change in Iraq, in the context of Iraq. The third point that comes to my mind when reflecting on these issues with having the Iraqi case as in my mind is concerned with the debate on how peace builder actors conceive and practice peace in Iraq. So looking at this from, I've been working on and in Iraq for now sometimes. So so I think I'm close to that ethnographic approach that Professor Caplan mentioned. It is clear that looking at what has been done in Iraq, it's clear that external actors have shared throughout time the same normative framework, that is the liberal peace framework. However, there have also been important changes in the practice of peace building, which is also reflected in the terminology that has been used by external actors, by peace builder actors in the country. So from state building to democracy promotion that were very popular at the beginning of the intervention, but no external actors dare to mention now state building and democracy promotion in Iraq. Rather, external actors, peace building actors are talking about stabilization, social cohesion, preventing violent extremism. So I do see changes in practices, even though the normative framework has not changed. The most visible change is an incremental and progressive move away from any political understanding of peace. So having instead the individual or the community as the main target of peace intervention, which of course has consequences. And over time, I can also observe the fact that there have been also changes in the way in which peace builders have understood the relationship between peace and other concepts. This is clear in the relationship between peace and stability, for instance. So if at the turn of the intervention in 2003 onwards, the idea was to produce a transformative change towards peace in order to guarantee a stable country, now these terms are the opposite. So we move towards stability and everything else will follow. So stability as a precondition for everything else. And the last point that with which I want to conclude is the point that Professor Caplan raised about local knowledge, the importance of a knowledge production that is shared with people and comes from as well local people. I do share this preoccupation with having better tools to measure peace, which also include local voices, but I also see an issue in terms of the stock taking of such knowledge. For instance, I was quite impressed during my last fieldwork in Iraq in April 2021, so a month ago, while I was actually doing some work for an NGO, and I came across the extensive data collection exercise conducted by NGOs in a specific area in the surrounding of Mosul. But actually, the result is that these this knowledge is not meant to be shared and is not shareable. So nothing can be built upon this knowledge, and which is, of course, an important limit. At the same time, voices from the communities lamented in these specific areas, lamented the fatigue of being surveyed, with people saying that they have been responding to more than 5 questionnaires over the previous month. So basically, they are tired of being involved in the process of knowledge production, which is telling about the problematic relationship between local communities and peace builder, because of course local communities do not see this knowledge translating into better interventions. So this works as a limit for improving peace intervention in the country, but I would say also generally speaking. I'll stop here because I think I'm over my 10 minutes, but I'm glad to speak more about some of these issues later on in the Q&A.
So thanks a lot, Irene. At this stage, we have a slight change of program, which is due just to issues with rail transportation, let's put it like that, related to some of our colleagues in the panel. So I would like to give the floor now to Alessandra Russo to continue. And Alessandra is, first of all, nice seeing you after some time. She's assistant professor at the School of International Studies of the University of Trento, where she teaches European and international politics and quantitative methods in social science. She's the author of 2 books on regionalism and of several journal articles. And her main research interests are on the post-Soviet region, with a particular focus on Ukraine and the Caucasus. And it is on this area that she will now contribute to the roundtable. So the floor is yours, Alessandra.
Thank you, Marco. Actually, the fact that we met around 10 years ago made me question about the fact that I still belong to the younger generations. And we were joking with Irene about it a few seconds ago. And
you know that the definition of young generation in Italy is pretty flexible. Yeah, let's leave it there.
Yeah, and I also have doubt about defining myself really as an area expert. I only can claim that I had the possibility of studying and of approaching the conflict in Ukraine, the study of the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in Georgia in close connection and really jointly with local sources of knowledge. So, and this work is the basis, the starting point of my ruminations today. And the first reaction to Professor Caplan's book and presentation is about the title itself and the extent to which I can apply these to this area of the world. And probably I should stick to the effort of measuring conflict instead of measuring peace, of using the notions of conflict stability instead of peace stability, and conflict survival instead of peace survival, and especially the issue of measuring conflict and even more problematically labeling conflict in Ukraine and in the other cases of the region is particularly problematic. Defining the nature of the conflict is problematic, and this is not only a conceptual problem. This has an effect on the success and the perceived legitimacy of international actions and endeavors to somehow solve this conflict, to settle this conflict, to broker some kind of peace. And so this is actually, yeah, the first reaction. While studying this conflict, again, in close connection to like hearing local voices, at least tentatively, I learned probably the biggest lesson I learned is that there is a general discontent about the lack of context specificity, context sensitivity in understanding, for example, the conflict in Ukraine, and local actors encountering and working with international actors in towards the resolution of this conflict really point out that being on the ground and knowing trying to delineate the real nature of the conflict, again, is of utmost importance. Now, in spite of these premises, I would like to share this image. I will try to, at least. Okay, this is a map that I don't particularly like, but it is a rather comprehensive map, and again, it's about labeling and defining the nature of this conflict. These 7 red numbers point to different ongoing conflicts that for years have been labeled frozen conflicts, and now this category seems to be less able to capture again the realities on the ground, and has been questioned especially in the last year, and especially after the revamping of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. Again, the problem of labeling was particularly in my mind even before Professor Caplan presentation, because when Emanuele sent us some discussion points to keep in mind while structuring our presentation, the first point was about, try to sketch the context. Is it a context of conflict, of crisis, of war, of instability? And that was my first problem. And I would like to bring here an anecdote occurred to me just on Tuesday, so early this week. And I was having a conversation for a research project with an EU official. And incidentally, I used the same category Professor Caplan used in relation to the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia, and the EU official was not only surprised, but he was disturbed, and he reacted to this word really used en passant, and he told me, oh, this is such a strong word, maybe we can call them violent clashes, or some security incidents, some security problems. And these ambivalences are the same that I could observe in the framework of my research, of our research, because it was really, again, a joint, a collaborative research on the conflict in Ukraine. Now, most accounts about the conflict in Ukraine tend to consider both like 2 dimensions. There is a political crisis, mainly unfolds in Kiev, and then a security crisis having erupted first with the self-proclamation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and then shortly after in the eastern provinces too. And then immediately after these events, 2013, 2014, a category gained traction, again, matter of labeling and labels to be contested, probably. That is the hybrid warfare. So a lot of commentators, a lot of scholars, as well as practitioners and policymakers started to use this category, which was not really used by, again, local sources of knowledge about the conflict. Now, the Ukrainian crisis, where I'm still struggling with finding the right category, the consensual category to describe this crisis, has represented a testing ground for some innovation introduced in the crisis management procedures designed by the European Union. And this new course inaugurated immediately before the eruption of the security crisis in Ukraine, included the introduction, the release for each context in which the European Union wanted to intervene of a political framework for crisis approach. So a document where the European Union really outlined the parameters and the perimeters of the crisis, the political context, articulating what the crisis was, and therefore why and how the European Union should have intervened. Now, this political framework in relation to the Ukrainian context was released in May 2014, and for several months was not accessible to the public. And the concept, the subsequent concept enabling the deployment of a civilian CSDP mission in support of the security sector reform in Ukraine was released a few weeks later. And again, this document defined the crisis, carefully avoiding the word crisis as a situation, so as a political situation, as a security situation. The document described the interference from Russia as the product of a dysfunctional and corrupt domestic government structure. And for many months, there was even a taboo about the presence of Russian military forces operating in Ukraine, a taboo that was broken in August 2014, and then in February 2015 in a document signed by Federica Mogherini. So these ambivalences, these nuances from the point of view of the European Union and the other actors trying to set negotiating tables and other initiatives were probably the only way to bring different actors at the same tables. But these definitional problems and the reticence to define the nature of the conflict, to me, well, not only in my opinion, are one of the major obstacles to really fulfill or to create conditions of peace, not to mention the problems of measuring peace after realizing it in that condition of chiaroscuro, of ambiguity. And I will stop here.
Thanks a lot, Alessandra. As you noticed, I started meddling with my background so that That's okay. Very much appreciate your contribution. It's very interesting. And let's move on with, I think we're having Laura following, or according to, so we're having Laura Berlingozzi, who is a PhD candidate in political science, European politics and international relations at the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Italy. She's also visiting researcher at the Free University of Brussels, and she worked on the interplay between gender, terrorism, and counterterrorism discourses and practices, focusing on the reconstruction of gender dimension in the EU and UN counterterrorism policies. And her area specialization is in the Sahel region, and she worked specifically on Mali and Niger. And this is the area that she will be contributing on. So Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marco, and thank you very much, everyone, for inviting me to take part to this interesting roundtable. And thanks, Professor Caplan, for your very inspiring presentation. I'll stick to the allocated time. I discussed the thesis on Friday, so I'm not a PhD candidate anymore. But
congratulations!
Thank you, thank you. I'd like to make 3 main points to contribute to the reflection on the situation in the Sahel, and which resonate with what Professor Caplan was saying before, and especially taking Mali as a paradigmatic case that might be fruitful to a broader and more general level. And the first is about the hybridity of conflict in Mali and how it changed in the last decade. Secondly, I'll talk about the inclusiveness of the peace process. And thirdly, on the counterproductive effects that counterterrorism and peacekeeping forces might have on the ground. So when talking about, of course, the Sahel region and Mali cannot be framed as a country or as countries where there is a stable peace. Very often when you hear talking about the Sahel, speakers make reference to a region confronted to a multifaceted crisis, sitting at the crossroad of intertwined challenges between illicit migration, drug trafficking, intercommunal and interacting rivalries led by self-defense armed militias, and a galaxy of jihadist insurgencies linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State that since the early 2000s have expanded their territorial control. The Islamic State West Africa province, ISWAP, operates in the Lake Chad region across Niger, Nigeria, and Chad, and the Islamic State Greater Sahara, who pledged allegiance to ISWAP in 2019, controls vast part of the tri-border area between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in this so-called Liptako-Gourma region. And JNIM, a group affiliated to Al-Qaeda, operates in vast part of central and northern Mali. So how did we get here? As it is really important, as Professor Caplan was saying, to have a more ethnographic approach and a deep understanding of local dynamics that trigger conflict. I will give you a few elements to understand how the situation is on the ground. Starting from 2003, members of the Algerian GIA moved to northern Mali and implementing a strategy between kidnapping industry targeting Western citizens, state collaboration with criminal groups, and linkages with communities through marriages. The group managed to establish itself in northern Mali. Then it rebranded itself in 2007 as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and a dysfunctional state governance system fostered popular grievances against the government, which ultimately paved the way to the collapse of the Malian state in 2012. In January 2012, the insurrection of the Mouvement National de Libération de l'Azawad, the MNLA, a Tuareg ethnic majority organization, provided Akim and the affiliated jihadist group as a strategic opportunity to establish an Islamic state in the northern region. Of course, the interests of the MNLA and of Hakim were different. On one side, you had the establishment of a secular and independent state. On the other, the institutionalization of an Islamic caliphate. After a series of defeats of the Malian army, the Republic of Azawad was proclaimed in April 2012. So the northern territories of Mali, Gao, Kidal, and Timbuktu, were occupied under the control of the MNLA and a coalition of Qaeda's groups. So this conjuncture alliance didn't last long because they had fundamental differences and divergence on the version of Sharia law, which led to the marginalization of the MNLA in the peripheral areas of the Kidal region. So as jihadist groups were advancing towards the center of the country in 2003, France launched first Operation Serval, with the objective of stopping the progression of jihadist groups southwards, assisting national armed forces and reconquering the north. This operation was successful and it created an enclave of jihadist mujahideen linked to Hakim in the north of the country. In the meantime, the MNLA had broken ties with Al-Qaeda and was co-opted by Paris as an ally to fight jihadist groups and obtain the recognition of a privileged position in the definition of the aftermath of the conflict. In 2014, there was the launch of another counterterrorism operation by France, Operation Barkhane, which counts 5,500 units, and which has actually contributed to stop the spread of jihadist armed groups towards the center, but in a way has effectively contributed to push Salafi armed groups towards the center and towards the south, creating an enclave of fighters along the three borders region between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. In 2013, MINUSMA, the UN Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, was launched, accounting nearly 12,000 peacekeepers, and was deployed to help the government to reassess the authority in the north. And after a long negotiation process in 2015, a peace agreement, the Alger Accord, was signed between the platform and a coordination of pro-government, non-jihadists. There are several issues, even if, so MINUSMA is mandated, as Professor Caplan was saying before, that MINUSMA sticks to its mandate. And actually, as the situation completely shifted on the ground, so the conflict moved from the north to the center, and now actually the center of Mali is even more problematic than the north. The peace agreement reflects a situation that on the ground is completely outdated. And while it doesn't represent the reality anymore, as the peace accord has created a whole political system and political regime behind it, Malian policymakers cannot reopen the discussion on reopening a negotiation process, which would actually reflect the situation on the ground. The negotiation process has been very long, and as Professor Caplan was saying, it is really difficult. It was very long and difficult because of all the different interests that are vested in a political peace process, which in the end, they proved really problematic because the signatory of the peace process do not collaborate. And this has also created many problems on the ground because, for example, if we take the case of joint patrols, it has happened that it increased frustration among local communities because they have been specifically targeted by the members of the signatories. Another problem is that the peace agreement doesn't include jihadist groups, and but only armed groups, so one could say that it excludes relevant actors on the ground. There are it seems that there are talks going on concerning dialogue with jihadist groups, but which are on the shade, and they have also met stark French opposition. Then, if we talk about peace process, just very briefly, you might have heard that in the meantime there have been since August 2012 two coups in Mali. The first by Assimi Goïta after months of protest and economic turmoil, and then which he agreed to an 18 months process of transition and putting in place an interim civilian government. However, he himself made a second coup in 2021, removing the prime minister and declaring himself the president of Mali, and saying that the election would be held in 2022. And now in front of the UN General Assembly, the prime minister said that these the presidential legislative elections set for February 22 could be delayed. And the main reason, he said, it's better to organize peaceful election recognized by all rather than organized election that will be disputed. So the decision on when the election will actually take place should be made sometime in October. Many observers say and believe that this delaying of election may actually deepen political instability and delay the restoration of civilian rule. So the fear is that this transition process might be compromised. And while in the meantime, Macron announced the reduction of the troops of Barkhane, to which Prime Minister Maïga replied that the French are abandoning Mali to its fate, leading to a situation similar to Afghanistan, which spurred a diplomatic crisis between Paris and Bamako. So to conclude, Mali has experienced almost a decade of violence, war and torn condition, and a steep decline in economy, which was worsened by the pandemic. And while many fear that the delay in holding the election is a ploy to prolong military rule, jihadist groups have expanded their control as ever before, and there is no end in sight of peace and stability in the region. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Laura. So we can go back to Riccardo. Riccardo Nanni is a PhD candidate in international relations at the University of Bologna. He received an MA in human rights and multi-level governance at the University of Padua, and a traineeship at the political section of the delegation of the European Union to China. And his current research interests focus on China's influence on global internet governance. So he's bringing us a different regional focus that I think is very much welcome and important. So off to you, Riccardo. And again, I will text you in case, so keep an eye on the chat in case for any update or any notes from my side, but the floor is yours. So Riccardo, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Marco. Thanks, Emanuele, for organizing, and thanks to the speakers before me. I have to make an initial point similar to Alessandra's, which is that I'm not quite an area scholar, but I'm actually building an expertise in international relations, although I'm building a geographical focus on China. I'm also not an expert in wars and conflicts. As I said, I study internet governance, so it's quite a challenge I'm very happy to pick up, to be put in the position to discuss such a relevant topic for international relations, but such a different one from the one I usually study. research and to apply it to my geographical area of focus. Now, speaking of China's neighborhood is quite a tricky thing to do. If we think of China's neighborhood, we tend to think of East Asia, the Asia Pacific, however defined. But if we take a simply geographical focus, we can see that China actually borders with such states as Russia, Afghanistan, Myanmar. So actually, it's a border that goes from the Pacific Ocean to Central Asia, and from Russia to the tropicals. So actually, it's quite a big and culturally, linguistically, politically heterogeneous region. So I would speak of a region that lives in a situation of stability, but this statement needs a qualification. And we need to look at least to two traditional levels of analysis, one that is the state-to-state one, and one that is the intra-state one. So if we look at conflicts between states, we see that probably the last fully fledged all-out war in the region was the Sino-Vietnamese one that started in 1979 and went on through the 80s, and that concluded with the end of Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia in 1989, and with the fall a few years earlier of the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, which was backed by the Chinese government. However, we saw border clashes between China and India this year. We see a situation of turmoil, coup d'etat in Myanmar. We've all seen, and we've already mentioned what is happening in Afghanistan. And it's also a region that has longer-standing rivalries, both in geopolitical terms. We see that, for example, South Korea and Japan are Western-leaning countries, so that geopolitically opposed to the other great power in the region, of course, the big elephant in the room being China. But it's also a situation where grievances from all the conflicts, such as the Second World War, have not been solved yet, with Japan not having put forward formal apologies for crimes of war during the Second World War, which of course has created political difficulties, to use a euphemism, in the area. And then of course there are other aspects that one can look at, such as, for example, the peculiar situation of Taiwan, which is de facto an independent state, but one that is only recognized by a dozen of small states, one that is undergoing an increasingly intense incursion of its airspace from the Chinese military. And of course, this is just at the state level, which is the first level of analysis I mentioned, the other one being the intrastate one. And at that point, we get a much more complicated view of the situation, one that allows less optimistic conclusions about the stability of the region. So starting from China, we see, for example, what is happening in Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, we have an ongoing process of repression of the spaces for democracy and civic engagement that characterize Hong Kong with respect to the rest of mainland China for the last roughly 2 decades. And that's one thing that can create instability within China. The other one being instead Xinjiang, the situation in Xinjiang is one that has been equated to genocide by many observers in time, and that's because, according to many sources, of course, I have no first-hand evidence of what I'm saying because I never had the possibility to visit Xinjiang, but according to many reliable sources, also institutional ones, a fully fledged process of ethnic replacement is going on, whereby the Chinese government is incentivizing immigration of Han Chinese, non-Muslim Chinese more in general into Xinjiang. There are evidences of Muslim families being given a Han relative who lives with you and introduces you to the culture and language and uses of the Han community, but that entails, of course, strict monitoring and reporting to the local cells of the communist parties. So this is one situation that has already created instability in the past and that can create instability in the future. We've all seen that China has accelerated its process of rapprochement with the Taliban short before, in the month preceding the Taliban's going back to power in Afghanistan. And one of the concerns China had was that the Sino-Afghan border, albeit very small, could become a porous frontier for jihadi fighters to come in and out of Xinjiang. Now, of course, the fact that jihad might be a problem in Xinjiang is to be taken seriously, but one of the factors behind that is that for a population living under such a repressive regime, there's a serious risk that any extremist or any alternative armed group or whatever political organization might become, in their perspective, a viable alternative to the status quo. So that, of course, the kind of situation that the Communist Party of China has created in Xinjiang can actually foster extremization and can actually foster instability and the possible creation or growth of extremist armed groups, which includes jihadi ones. And so this is just to talk about China, of course. But then if we move to other countries in the region, well, we've already discussed Afghanistan. We can see a situation of instability being posted in been growing actually in Myanmar after the fall of the previous government. There's been a coup d'etat, there are protests in the street. The Rohingya situation has been ongoing now for decades at this point, and it's been known in the West possibly in the last 10 years in particular, as in there was media coverage, but of course the situation is older. And then we see a regression of democracy in India with very strong authoritarian tendencies from the Modi government, a situation that has been made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit India quite strongly, and therefore that is likely to create further backlash within the country. So to put it short, yes, if we look at it, if we look at the region in a purely traditional geopolitical state-to-state perspectives, we can see that the region is pretty stable. There's a balance of power. There are no, there's no risk of all-out conflicts within the region. There are notable exceptions like Taiwan, but there again, few observers believe that any military invasion is likely to happen soon, although in the last couple of days there have been hypotheses made public that something like that might happen before 2025, but that's still something that is being discussed. However, if we look within countries, we see situations of structural violence and ethnic cleansing and discriminatory practices that can lead to forms of extremization, radicalization, and that can bring that kind of ethnic discrimination to stem into some sort of ethnic conflict or armed conflict. After all, armed groups in Xinjiang have always existed, at least in the current century, and have been more or less active depending on the times. But it's also been the case that the radicalization process also happened because of repressive policies set up by the Beijing government. I see that the time's up, so I hope I haven't taken too much space. I give the floor back to Marco. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Riccardo, and I would like to thank again all our 4 contributors now to the roundtable. The plan was to go back to Professor Caplan for some feedback and to feedback into this conversation also because obviously the points that were raised were very much in a dialogue both with the presentation and the book. So let's go back to Professor Caplan for some feedback, and then we will also see how we're faring. We're a bit above the time allocated for this, but I think it's going to be interesting for those of you who can. Those of you who cannot stay with us, again, thank you very much for joining us today. But let's try this at least for a few minutes.
Thank you. And thank you all 4 of you for really very, very interesting and I want to say informed and informative presentations. And it brings to mind one point, which in some respects you might think is unrelated to this topic, but actually I think it's fundamental to this topic, and that is the importance of regional studies from an academic standpoint. And I'm going to throw this question out to you. You don't have to answer it immediately, but if you may be aware that in the United States, in North America, in conventional political science, in the kind of more, if you will, orthodox circles reflected in the American Political Science Association, there's been a tendency to downgrade the importance of regional studies. It's really been almost relegated to an area outside of political science. I mean, this has been a process ongoing for some time. Indeed, I'd say it's very nearly complete. Of course, if you go to, for instance, the annual convention of the International Studies Association, you get a very different view because it's much broader, more interdisciplinary. But it's just, I don't know what the question I asked you is, what is the situation, for instance, among academics in Italy, the extent to which study of regions and countries within the regions is still considered to be important. I mean, you have a fantastic tradition, reflected, for instance, in Orientale, of regional institutes. And now I go back to the book and to some of the comments that have been made here, but I think that it's extremely important. We can see how so many misjudgments have arisen as a consequence of a failure to understand properly, again, local dynamics. And that is not to say that they are easy to grasp even by those who do have what one might call expertise in the region. I think that this was very evident in Irene's comments. I was very struck by what you had to say about the local knowledge, generation of local knowledge in northern Iraq. I'm not surprised, but survey fatigue being one factor. But there is a danger arising from a failure to recognize the limitations of what we know. There's a corresponding danger arising from an overconfidence of what we think we know. And so it's really the other side of the coin, where individuals who can, with I think some legitimacy, claim to have insights, perhaps claim too much for themselves at the same time. And then the other thing is, and this goes back to a point I made at the end, these are very complex social dynamics that are very fluid. A lot of work has been done recently, people like Cedric de Koning applying complexity theory to our understanding of conflict situations and peace building. And, we fail to, again, appreciate that these are often non-linear developments, that they take place at different levels within even the same community or same society at different times. So it becomes very, very difficult sometimes to generalize. And I think that poses a real challenge for anybody who's trying to understand what the requirements are for establishing peace, even in the most basic sense in which one can use the term, which is the absence of armed conflict defined in, if you will, conventional terms of less than 25 battle-related deaths. But when you get beyond that, in trying to identify the requirements for peace, well, then you get into the problems of whose peace, what kind of peace, and so forth. There's so much that I could say. Let me just say maybe one or two other things. Also very struck, and I think others were too, Alessandra, by what you had to say about how we characterize the implications of the language that we use. And we see this well beyond even the context that we've been discussing. Sometimes we euphemize, we talk about collateral damage now, which removes entirely the human dimension from our discussions, from our analysis. And then you think about language that we're careful to use or not to use because of what the implications are for adoption of such language. And I'm thinking in particular about the whole debate that took place around Darfur. And was Darfur a genocide, for instance? And it was quite significant when Colin Powell took the plunge, if you will, and referred to the situation in that region as a genocide. And of course, the risk then is that if especially you're party to the international convention, that entails certain responsibilities on states. So and similarly, the use of the word occupation. Think about the the West Bank, where Israel has often resisted acceptance that it is an occupying power. So yes, I think there are definitional problems. I'm not surprised that you encountered those in your own work, because language is itself very potent and potentially explosive. And the other, I was also thinking, just Laura, a little bit, your presentation, also struck by what you had to say about the peace accord being outdated. It reminded me also of how the agreement that nominally brought an end to the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina created further problems, entrenching ethnic divisions, while at the same time it was thought that it was helping to lay the foundations for a lasting peace, but it has actually also, if you will, laid the foundations for violations of human rights. And this takes us maybe a little bit outside of the area in which I have been working on on peace building, but it certainly is very relevant to mediation, to negotiations, to the design of peace accords. And we know that these are imperfect instruments precisely because they need to achieve buy-in from parties who, again, have often very fundamental visions about the kind of peace, the kind of society that they wish to subscribe to. So that is an inherent difficulty, that we have to recognize. And yeah, I mean, Riccardo, again, I recognize too, you work in a different area, but everything that you had to say about the regions underscores how peace can be a very impoverished peace, if you will, a very deficient peace, a very maybe minimal peace that to varying degrees is really just shy of conflict, just shy even of violent conflict. This goes back to what I said at the outset, that quote from Willy Brandt. Sometimes that's all we can achieve. We might work towards achieving more or better, and I don't wish to cheapen the value, if you will. I mean, a Cold War, a cold peace is better than no peace, but we have to recognize that it has its inadequacies, and it is important to take measures to help to strengthen, to enhance the quality of the peace that we're building. And I think that's very evident through many of the examples that you gave through the region. So anyway, thank you all very, very much for your rich reflections drawn from your own areas of expertise.
Thank you very much. And I think at this stage, I will go back to Emanuele.
Yes, so thank you very much, Marco. And so I guess we don't have time for Q&A. I don't see any question in the chat. But
it's Matteo who raised his hand. But...
Oh, maybe, Matteo?
Yes, please. Yes, I mean, I don't think we have time for Q&A, but I wouldn't want to finish this without, of course, thanking Professor Caplan and everybody who participated. I'm sure you were going to do that as well. But there is another thing that I would like to do. Since he asked a direct question, I would like to sort of answer it like head on, and while we are still on the record, so that if one day someone like my body disappears and I'm not found again, at least it's a little bit, I leave this testimony, because basically, like he talked eloquently about the APSA versus ISA intellectual debate on the sort of like role of area studies and local expertise in the American context. And let it be known that this intellectual debate like acquires in Italy a gory and I would say almost a sort of well, my English maybe is not good enough, but it's a gory ministerial / bureaucratic undertone because of the existence of the so-called settori concorsuali. So what is a sometimes sort of tightly argued and intellectually fruitful debate in the American, or to some extent the British intellectual scene, here is a matter of, becomes a matter of academic life or death because of this thing of the settori concorsuali. And where do we stand? I mean, where we stand, so since we're all SPS 04 here, Scienza Politica, I mean, to a great extent, even the role of international relations, let alone area studies, is still called into question within Italian political science. This, for positive reasons, the fact that we had a great tradition in the study of party systems and so on and so forth, and for like less noble reason that basically this is what students want. And that's like people feel threatened by the fact that students want to study international relations. And within this, I mean, within this sort of like, we do have area studies that are new and that we are also are also sort of what students want more and more. I mean, we've seen this, like just take the example of Oxford. We have had a very successful MPhil in area studies that have proven since the start of with the School of Interdisciplinary Area Studies, but now it's become the School of Global Studies. I mean, this has been a great roaring success in Oxford. And, you know, si parva licet, I mean, even in our own little backwater here in Italy, that's still what students want. And so, like, now we've had even the start of a DPhil in Global and Area Studies in Oxford. And here, though, this is very, very difficult because we do have settori concorsuali, we do have a list of journals that is very difficult to expand, in which you need to publish if you want a career at all. I mean, anything that you write outside these journals, it cannot even be considered by the commissions that evaluate you at the national level, abilitazione scientifica nazionale. So this is where we stand. Ultimately, you know, it is really sort of some kind of like, you know, measuring peace. In this case, we're measuring like conflict, but it is a sort of trench warfare. And we are kind of making progress because, you know, the march of history and all of that, I mean, like, and ultimately that's what students want to study. And so I feel that we are going to come to a sort of like a rather fruitful accommodation. I think I'm cautiously optimistic about that. But so that you know that it's very, very difficult. I mean, and what you came to you as a brilliant idea, so like of, and it is almost sort of a commonsensical thing to do, to merge the expertise that we have in Università Orientale in Naples, in Foscari, all these people who know these regions very well and could fruitfully contribute to sort of like our discipline. It is very, very difficult to implement because of this bureaucratic structure. We are going in that direction. We hope to do well. We are certainly slower and, you know, even because of these ministerial silos that we have, and we cannot but sort of like envy and admire what actually has been going on in Oxford with this, with the new DPhil in Global and Area Studies, which is in itself, I think, a benchmark for all of the world, including the United States of America. So I just wanted to put this on the record before we ended our like jolly meeting today. So thank you, everyone.
And I endorse every single word that you said, Matteo. We have some troubles here in Italy with the relationship between you know, international relations and area studies. Alessandra just posted a message on the chat. Please check the upcoming issue on the Italian Political Science Review about dialectics between IR and area studies. So hopefully,
featuring other young. Like young colleagues and Irene, I mean, among the youngest.
Oh, very good. The youngest. Okay, so so I guess we can end here. So let me thank again the Professor Caplan for your further comments on the roundtable, and I guess today we had a really fruitful discussion, and personally, I learned a lot. So thank you all again for your participation. Let me thank again the 4 speakers who kindly accepted the invitation, and I would say also kindly agreed to follow the format we suggested for their contribution. So again, thanks to Irene, Alessandra, Laura, and Riccardo, and of course, many thanks to Marco Pinfari, who chaired this roundtable really well. This is the last webinar of the 2021 series, but I really hope there will be a chance to do it again in the future. Maybe we can discuss again this really beautiful topic of peace. So thanks again, and have a good weekend.